Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It's a very pleasant evening in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh, and it was an absolute pleasure listening to Dr. Kakop Azim, sir. Of course, my ideal when it comes to academics and sports. So, without taking much of your time, I'll start with my presentation. But before that, a small introduction as to who I am and what is my relevance to this present conference. Uh, I, Mohammad Adil Ansari, am a sports lawyer basically, and a research scholar in sports law and jurisprudence, particularly also specializing in criminology along with that. So, the topic which I'll be presenting today would be sports and crime, the anthropological twins. So, you see, throwball as a concept, I was introduced to that concept way back in December, like last year itself, and I was quite mesmerized by, the very therapeutic approach which this sport has taken. Unlike most of the sports which we find in our daily life, there's a competitive edge or an impulsive competitive tactic which is attributed to that. There's a certain degree of violence which is expected out of it. Now, by violence, I do not mean to say like a physical violence, but I mean to say violence as an attitude. You see, for any sport to have a success within the domain of the public perception, there has to be a certain degree of engagement. And we know it for a fact that people like to engage much more with violence than to any other human activity. And that is why we see that whenever it comes to violence or crime, we find that people are interested in those stories. Most of the movies which are successful are, action movies. Most of the sports which are successful, there's an element of violence. And they become much more successful when there's certain degree of bad blood which is infused in the game. For example, if you take into bodybuilding, um, we have a lot of rivalry stories which actually make the sport much more profitable for the organizations. For example, the Kyrie in the Phil Heath fiasco. There was a lot of bad blood, a lot of trash talking going on, and then we find that on stage, people would enjoy that immensely. Again, when it comes to cricket, well, whenever there's a heated exchange between the players, suddenly the crowd is all cheerful and all enthusiastic. So, in one way or another, we have to accept that people like to enjoy violence. Okay, but why is that so? And that is why we need to acknowledge, and I thought that that would be relevant for the purpose of this conference, that a certain, a link needs to be drawn between the sport and crime, because in both these elements, there's a certain degree of violence which attracts the attention, which attracts the participation of the people. And what is that? What is that? Before just going to the theoretical things and the anthropological justifications which we have for that, what we find is that within a sport, we tend to determine the winner, but winner on the basis of skill, often a degree of chance or the element of luck has a role, of course, and that makes it much more, interesting at the end of the day. But there's a certain degree of skill which is expected, and the combat is between the participants as to who has the superior skill. The one who is better is going to win. Or we could just, talking in the philosophical realm, we could simply say the one who is much more equipped with engaging with the violence against the other. I mean, the violence can be tactical, it can be strategic, it can be physical. Okay, so all these things, the moment somebody engages it against the other, well, then we have a sport. We have a few judges, a certain degree of judges who are responsible for adjudicating the result of the game. Now, when it comes to crime, what we find is that crime also has an element of play to that, like mobsters, like youngsters who plunge into crime. Most of them have an aura of they are quite taken by the just sorry for the disturbance which is coming from outside voice. That's outside. That's not that's beyond my control. So I hope my voice remains audible and I'm not distracted by that. So okay, okay. I think it's getting out of hand. Ma'am, should we?
Yeah,
May I,
your voice is audible, Adil.
okay, it's
Yeah,
audible. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So just a moment, please. Let them. Okay, okay, okay. So sorry for the disruption. Again, that was out of my control. Again, the crime has an element of play to that. Why? Because youngsters more or less are attracted to that so as to display the dominant, an urge to represent themselves, to assert themselves as dominant. Most of the crimes, why do they happen? Why do they happen? Simply because, of course, there's a certain degree of bad blood which might be between people. There can be jealousy, there can be hatreds, there can be some valid points, or there can be a failure of judiciary. Now, what does judiciary actually does? It adjudicates between the winner on the basis of the merits of the case and not on the basis of the brute strength. And in that case, what we find, the similarity between sport and any judicial authority is that both of them are adjudicating authorities. One of them adjudicates on the basis of merit of your case, and the other one adjudicates on the basis of your skill set. Now you see what the where the parallel is coming. In any society, what we find is the state has certain laws. There's a whole paradigm of laws which basically conceptualizes the concept of nation as a functioning republic or a democracy, or it can be even a oligarchy or a dictatorship. That is irrelevant though. But for any system to work, there is one implied presumption that the law should promote social order. And on the other hand, what does sport stand for? Of course, sport has a certain degree of orderly aspect to that, but the main contention of sports as a field is to promote conflict, isn't it? And that is why it is important that we take both these domains of human social behavior and use it for the most productive utilization of the human I would say society which we have at our disposal. Man is basically dictated by three factors. According to Johann Huizinga, he wrote a book back in 1944 that was Homo Ludens. And he said that apart from being man, being called as Homo sapien, that means a thinking man, man is also Homo faber. That means the man, the maker. It means the man has an inbuilt ability to innovate. But uh, beyond that, man is also Homo ludens. Homo ludens means that man has an instinctive urge to play, an instinctive urge to compete, an instinctive urge to try to assert its dominance. You see, way back, it was it's quite an accepted theory, though it can be with its flaws and but certainly with certain merits as well. Paul McKellen basically he said there was a system which we call the triune brain model, which says that the human brain can be divided into three parts, and the oldest part is called basal ganglia, and after that we have the limbic system, and then of course the neocortex. Now the thinking part, the conscious part, the one which is responsible for a social interaction, for a language, for a emotional connectivity to or to the ability to sympathize with people or with objects, that is dictated by neocortex. But when it comes to the element of competition, then the urge to survive, the urge to dominate one's, uh, I would say, existence, one's presence, that is dictated by the oldest, you know, system within our brain that is basal ganglia, and it's also called the reptilian brain. So we find that the human brain basically has three, layers of covering, and the most evolved part of that is the one which is connected with language, with emotional connect, or the emotional sentience which we have. But we cannot simply ignore the oldest part, the reptilian one, the one which is responsible for competition, the one which is responsible for conflict, the one which urges a man to do, go beyond the normal social behavior and search for conflict or search for ambition or search for adventure. The problem with the legal systems is that they do not acknowledge this part. And any legal system which does not acknowledges this part, well, it's a biological thing. It exists. It is going to manifest itself. Okay. Sigmund Freud said, and he basically said it in the context of trauma, that a trauma which is unhealed would manifest sooner or later in much more uglier forms, because the trauma is there to stay. And the same thing applies for human instincts as well. If you do not give a certain room for exercise of these essential human instincts, they're bound to, exfoliate in ways which are ugly, and of course harmful for the society. And that is why sport is important, because sport allows humans, and for that matter animal sports as well, sport allows you a room, a channel to exercise these instincts. And if you do not allow them, they are bound to resort to other ways, uh, other means which are available within the social order, so as to exercise these instincts. And that is why we find that in most of the teenagers, they there's an urge for violent behavior, and it is at that stage, when it comes to teaching pedagogy, uh, we recommend people to engage in sports. Sports is important for that purpose, because if you are not allowed to exercise this instinct, it is going to manifest. It is going to come out in ways, and it has been proved. I'm going to cite few papers for that purpose, and they are of course very well acclaimed ones. The first one is by Bruce, who said that that one's behavior, the behavior of play, is essentially biological in nature. Stanley Hall, in his 1920 paper Theory of Recapitulation, he said, and reiterated Bruce's idea that ludic behavior is biological in nature, and it is essentially linked to your mental health. You see, in today's world, mental illness, depression, these kind of things, they're becoming a lot more common. Why is that so? I mean, there's a lot of luxury around. You have, a lot more available opportunities to exercise your faculties. But then why is that every country which is marching towards a first world order is having a certain degree of mental illness, or an array of such illness attached to them? It's simply because of this factor that the element of play is being ripped off out of it. This also explains why young teenagers and children for that purpose are addicted to games, mobile games, these kind of games which we have on your computers, PUBG for that purpose, because they allow your children the room to exercise their instinctive ludic impulse. And that is important. That is important for the healthy functioning of one's personality. Any person who is devoid of that is bound to suffer with a certain degree of handicap to its own, I would say, potential. be it mental faculty, be it one's personality, one's behavior. All these things, they are going to, be hampered because of that. I'll just illustrate it through an example that, you just look for that matter, just look into the pedagogy which is or the methodological skills which are deployed in rehabilitation centers or old age homes. You know, these places, you know, there's an attempt to deploy the same pedagogical tools which are deployed in pre-nursery classes. If you must have noticed, in play schools, in pre-nursery classes, children are, the way we induce learning to them is by incorporating an element of play. You just bring the ball, you just, arrange a certain puzzles in a manner, you color them, you induce an element of play to that. In old age homes, of course, in old age homes, where if you have people out there, they are there's a, you know a certain degree of trauma is expected out of the people who are admitted over there. It's out of compulsion, basically, if somebody has to resort to old age homes in order to get them to give them as a, some relief from their trauma which they might have faced. We induce them in some kind of competitive painting, insert some musical events, some play events. Throw ball for that purpose. I'll just come back to the topic which is relevant for the purpose of this conference. Throw ball, and I would appreciate the International Throw Ball Federation for that purpose, is that the people, the federation, and the people who have conceived this idea of throw ball, they recognized this principle way ahead, and they took a lead in this department. I was quite fascinated when I saw that instead of, I would say, focusing on the cutthroat competition which is promoted by other sports, particularly when it comes to, if you are comparing to ball sports, in football, for that matter, cricket, or I would give you the example of calcio. Yeah. Calcio is a sport which is played in Italy for quite a while now, and interestingly, Henry III, the monarch of that time, when he witnessed this game, it's the game. I'll just give you a brief example. It's basically that there are two teams of 11 or 12 people, or it may be 24, that depends. There's a ball, and they have to get the ball from one side of the field to another side, and the opposite side also has to do it with respect to their own target to the other side of the field. And for that purpose, they are allowed to use any kind of violence they can deploy. No, of course, they are not allowed to use guns or swords for that matter, but they are allowed a free use of their hands, of their legs. It's a brutal sport, and it's, for even today it is played, and it has a massive audience to itself. And Henry III, for that matter, when he witnessed this sport for the first time, he said it, and I'll just quote that Calcio is too small to be a real war, but too cruel to be a game. You see, it was too small to be a real war, but it was too cruel to be a game. George Orwell, the most acclaimed author of 20th century, his opinion, he wrote a piece way back in 1940s or something, that football, the violence which was associated between the audiences, which supported opposing teams, that football was, or in sports for that matter, was war minus shooting, and that was his opinion. And even in the medieval time, the church and the state would prohibit sport; they would discourage sport. But over the period of time, we have seen the sport has been, evolved. Just like that, the political conflict which used to happen in the form of wars, it has evolved in the form of parliamentization, sports, the element of play, it has evolved in the concept of sportization. And throw ball, for that purpose, I would appreciate, and the federation and the game for that matter, that it recognized this element, the therapeutic element of play. Throw ball has recognized it very well. There's no element of violence in that. Almost anyone can play. There's no element of, even if the violence which is deployed against the opposite team, that is to its bare minimum. And not only throw ball, I would also like to point out the frisbee game. Even in that sport, after the people have played, they just sit down, they discuss that whatever good has happened, what are the pros and the cons and everything. So I think throw ball is a good initiative, and we need to take a cue. All the academicians, educators, sportsmen, sports federation, they need to take a cue as to why sport is important for law enforcement, for open prisoners, for the prisoners. Sports therapy is something which is quite an upcoming field, and in certain jurisdictions across the world, it has been deployed for a time now. So sports can be used for a therapeutic purpose. It can be used for the rehabilitation of traumatized victims. It can be used for the rehabilitation of criminals, and of course, it can be used, and it is important. I say that with utmost urgency, and it is important as we progress and march headways towards a first world order, which is more dictated by things such as artificial intelligence and armchair research or workforce. So, with that, I would like to end. Thank you so much for your time and listening to me.